Welcome to the politicalbetting.com Polling Matters show. My name is Keiran. Well, as part of our mini-series on the devolved elections, today we're going to be talking about Scotland. As many viewers and listeners will know, there is so much to talk about in Scotland and what's happened in the past year or so. The independence referendum, which was, of course, lost by the yes side, gave way to a SNP surge last May, which means that the Scottish Nationalists have all but 2 seats in Westminster. And now we see the Scottish Parliament elections coming next week. What might we expect? Is the SNP dominance of politics north of the border going to continue? What will happen with the Labour Party? And what might the implications of the upcoming EU referendum be for Scotland's very existence within the United Kingdom? Well, I'm no expert on Scotland, but fortunately, I'm joined by some. Kate Devlin, welcome back to the show.
Hello.
Political correspondent from the Herald. And joining us down the line is Craig McAngus from the University of Aberdeen. Craig, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So I guess let's start at the beginning. Craig, for those people that are listening or watching that don't necessarily have an in-depth understanding of the Scottish Parliament, maybe you could spend a couple of minutes explaining a little bit about what it does and how people that serve there are selected.
Okay, well, the Scottish Parliament was opened in 1999. It's been a long drawn-out process of deciding what the Parliament would look like. We'll get to that here. But what does the Parliament do? Well, the Parliament has changed. There's been successive Scotland bill in 2011. Remember that, and then there's another one to come before there's powers. In 1999, what did it do? Effectively, the Scotland Act 1998 didn't actually tell anyone what the Scottish Parliament actually did. It basically outlines what the Scottish Parliament doesn't have control over. It's known as reserved matters in a part of the Scotland Act known as Schedule 5. And basically what the Scottish Parliament doesn't have power over are basically the high politics of states, so things like foreign affairs, macroeconomic policy, immigration, social security, so there are bloody areas there, and constitution, monarchy, etc., EU relations, and that sort of stuff. And then everything else is it's pretty much under the remit of the Scottish Parliament. So we're looking at things like education, both higher education, further education, and schools, primary schools, childcare, preschool, etc. The health service is involved. We have a whole range of social policy areas, elderly care and social care in the community. It's all devolved. Agriculture, fisheries, and a whole range of pretty much everything that isn't in that sort of reserved powers list. But we must remember that when it really comes down to the nitty-gritty of how policy is made, often there's some grey areas there, but the distinction is fairly simple.
And how is it actually how are the members that serve there actually selected? Because I know that in Wales, obviously, it's a proportional system, which is different to how MPs are selected in Westminster. I think that's the same in Scotland, isn't that right?
Well, the electoral system is it's the same. The proportion of list MSPs to constituency MSPs is slightly higher in Scotland. I think in Wales it's 60-40, but in Scotland it's 57-43%. So you basically have 2 ballot papers in the Scottish election. You firstly choose your constituency, who you want to be your constituency MSP, and that's a first past the post contest. And then there's the regional list, the additional member system, if you like, whereby you choose a political party, and those members on the list are calculated according to how many or how few of their political party have won seats in the constituency. So Scotland's divided into 8 electoral regions. So let's just imagine that we're in northeast Scotland, for example. We'll have constituency seats in Aberdeen, west and north Aberdeenshire, and Angus down towards Dundee. So what happens is, if a party wins most of or all of those seats on the constituency, then it becomes more difficult for them to win a seat on the list, because the idea of the list is to top up to kind of recalibrate, to proportionalise the system, so that there are a lot fewer wasted votes.
Okay, well, let's look at headed to the election next week. There's been a lot of polling out, and I'll bring you in, Kate, at this stage. And there's been a lot of polls out sort of saying what's going to happen. It does look like the SNP's dominance of politics north of the border are going to continue, doesn't it? I mean, it's quite interesting, I suppose, that actually, given that, as Craig mentions, the electoral system is designed to sort of not really allow for majority governments, but yet the SNP dominates, doesn't it?
Indeed, and the irony of this election is that this system was created to stop the dominance of one political party, and that political party was supposed to be Scottish Labour, and that was the fear when it was set up in 1999. But the SNP did manage just about to get a majority the last time, and it certainly looks, according to the polls, as if they're on course for another majority. And the polls have been very strong for the SNP for a very long time now. At one point, there was a kind of funny moment when the polls showed that the SNP had fallen slightly to, kind of the giddy lows of 58%. And so this is where Scottish politics has been for quite a while now. But in that, there's a bit of a problem for the SNP, and they're starting to worry that they've been ahead for so long and so far ahead that they may be bleeding votes on this second constituency list. And there's a worry that pro-independence groups like the Greens or like the new entrants, the Rise Party, might end up taking these votes. SNP people would see it as taking these votes from the SNP, potentially causing a bit of problem for this idea about getting majority. So the SNP is now very strongly pushing both votes SNP.
Now let's look at some of the polling, because I know that Ipsos have had a poll. Well, to be fair, lots of pollsters have had polls out. I know BMG and Salvation. I know BMG are your pollster, and Salvation also do lots of work here. So we see very clearly that the SNP dominating. But as you say, I guess it will be interesting to see whether that manifests itself. I mean, the other story looks at the battle between the Conservatives and Labour for second place. And I suppose traditionally the argument went that Labour are going to come second. Really, don't really worry about it. But I mean, what's your sense of that? Because it does feel like that's a more credible situation in terms of the Tories coming second than maybe we once thought it was.
It's much more credible. Certainly the polls are suggesting, for every poll that shows Labour coming second, another one shows the Conservatives coming second. It's created a very unusual position, actually, in Scottish politics, where both the Scottish Labour and the Scottish Tory leader and now having effectively to deny that they would, or to say that they would not resign if they don't come second, and a pretty far second at that. And so this is essentially where the real battle lies in Scotland at the moment. It would be astonishing if Labour came third in Scotland when they were once so dominant not that long ago. That said, the Tories appear to have hit a point where voters understand more where they are in the Scottish political structure, and that's effectively because of the independence referendum. What it did was it created a divide.
Nationalist.
Absolutely,
divide, yeah.
Absolutely. That divide is still there, and that divide is still playing into the Scottish Parliament elections. And that's where it is. It's all about kind of unionism versus nationalism.
I mean, let's unpick some of this. Craig, I'll bring you back in. There's some other polling that we've looked at which shows, again from this Ipsos poll for STV, which shows sort of perceptions of whether the SNP are doing a good or bad job in government. And I suppose maybe this is quite illustrative of the extent of the dominance that the SNP has across a wide range of factors, whether it's managing the economy, 56% say the SNP doing a good job, 34% say bad, and then across a range of other factors such as improving the standard of living for poor people, improving your standard of living, handling public finances, and so on and so forth. The SNP is seen as doing a good job in government in Scotland. I mean, what's your perception of their situation at the moment? It does feel like the SNP is very strong and seen as doing well.
Yes, just to make a quick on what Kate said about the Tories and Labour, the battle for second place is really interesting because it's less about how well the Tories are doing. I mean, we're looking at the Tories getting back to where they roughly were in 1999. They won 18 seats in 1999. They fell back to It was about 17 in 2007, 15 in 2011. And so they're getting back to kind of where they were in 1999. They really haven't shifted that much. It's all about kind of the fall of Labour, which is just, it's phenomenal. But going back to your point about the ratings on the SNP, the reason why the SNP have been electorally successful since 2007, and we have to kind of, there's almost people forget that there was a time in Scottish politics before the referendum. Why were they elected in 2007, and then why did they win the majority in 2011? It's because of three things. Firstly, that people in Scotland see the SNP as the most competent party of government. They're the party that deliver on public services and outcomes on health and education and whatnot more effectively than any of the other parties. The second thing is that the party has had the most effective leadership and the most known leadership. And you know, Alex Salmond was a very popular leader, although he was divisive amongst some people. He had a problem with women sometimes, according to some statistics. But they have had a stronger front bench team. I mean, I don't think many people would argue with that. And then the third thing is that they are seen as standing up for Scotland. And some of the data from the 2011 Scottish election study is, you know, they're phenomenally ahead of Labour in terms of how the public perceive them standing up for Scotland's interests. I think the other thing that has to be taken into account here, and I'm just talking in broad terms based on the figures that I just saw, is that devolution up to this point has made, I'll try to word this carefully, because you don't have the full range of macroeconomic powers, the full range of powers that would be associated with the Treasury, for example, in Westminster, then there's always the accusation, and there's always the get out from the SNP that they're simply managing what they're getting handed down from Westminster. And the Scottish budget has been squeezed, as has every other budget in the West. And what that's done is that the SNP have been able to kind of portray themselves in the position, whereas we are having our budget cut by Westminster, a lot of the difficult decisions are being imposed on us. We have to make difficult decisions, but we are the party that's best placed to make those difficult decisions. And I think that's kind of where the public are. They understand that there need to be difficult decisions made, and I think they believe and they perceive the SNP as being the party that's most able to make those difficult decisions. And I think that broadly is one explanation of those statistics that you had on the slide there.
I mean, it feels like almost a dream position for the SNP, doesn't it? Like all the good stuff they get the credit for because they, you know, stand up for Scotland, but all the negative stuff, that's Westminster's fault. I mean, I want to move on to the Labour point because this is something that's capturing people's attention, maybe south of the border, particularly given that Jeremy Corbyn was elected Labour leader and seen as someone that may be able to help Labour recover north of the border. I mean, we can argue about whether that's fair to assume he would have done so already, but there was a finding in this STV poll which I thought was interesting. I think Kate alluded to it earlier, which was that Scots were asked whether they had a good idea or whether they agreed or disagreed that they sort of had a strong understanding of what each party stood for. 80% said they agreed that they understood what the SNP stood for, but only 45% said the same of Labour. And I suppose, Kate, you were mentioning this point earlier. You know, how do they actually get back north of the border? Because you mentioned that, of course, Labour is never going to out the SNP on devolution or independence or things like that. They do have a popular policy, which I think you're going to come to on taxation in this campaign, but for whatever reason, that doesn't seem to be manifesting itself in votes at the moment, does it?
I think there's a couple of reasons for this poll and for these findings. I think one of them is that Scottish Labour has had two leaders since the independence referendum, two very different leaders in Jim Murphy and now Kezia Dugdale. And I think there are still lots of voters out there who are struggling to get a handle on them and what they, where the party is exactly. I think the Tories have also capitalised very strongly on two things that happened last September, which was in quick succession, the Scottish Liberal Democrat leader and then the Scottish Labour leader, Kezia Dugdale, suggested that they could ally their politicians to campaign for independence the next time around. And so the Scottish Conservatives see themselves as outflanking both of the other unionist parties when it comes to sticking up for the union. So you've got a kind of narrative here that is, on the one hand, sticking up for
They're
Scotland.
the unionist party,
And on the other,
essentially. Yeah.
absolutely, they are the unionist party, is how they're putting it at the moment. But I think it's worse for Labour because, as you mentioned, we had a poll, a BMG poll last week that showed that when people were asked about Labour's flagship policy in this election, they quite liked it. When they were told it was a Labour policy, they liked it an awful lot less. And that even applied to undecided voters, i.e. exactly the kind of people that Labour is now trying to win over in this election.
I mean, Craig, do you think it's just a case that Labour is essentially finished in Scotland? I mean, it certainly doesn't look like they're going to go back to the dominance that they had once upon a time. But, I mean, where does the party go from here? Because it feels from listening to what Kate's saying that the Tories may have a very, I don't know if niche is the right word, but they have a sort of certain type of appeal north of the border, which is couched in unionism and maybe support around the border areas and things like that. But ultimately, Labour is kind of caught between the two and runs the risk of losing its identity completely.
Yeah, I mean, political parties can obviously reorganise, shift power from this part of the party to that part of the party and change a whole lot of internal dynamics. Sometimes, though, the social, economic and cultural context just changes around you, and there's sometimes just very little that you can do. I think if we look at the union, I mean, Michael Keating argued that there are three pillars of the union. The first is the landed gentry, the landed classes, then you've got the sort of the industrial bourgeoisie, and then the third one is organised labour. Now, if we're talking about organised labour, that is no longer there to anywhere near the same extent that it was 50, 60 years ago. That was the bedrock of labour support. I mean, labour support, again, another book that people should go and maybe read is Jerry Hassan and Eric Shaw's book, and it's entitled The Death of Labour Scotland. They don't talk about the death of Scottish Labour. They talk about the death of Labour Scotland. That Labour Scotland is more than the party. That and we're talking about a certain part of Scotland. There are parts of Scotland that don't have that labour history. But certainly in the industrial heartlands, and the steel mills, and the coal mining areas, it was you kind of lived labour. You were part of an industrial community that had kind of labour in its bones, if you like, in a very cultural way, in a very existential way. So those things have obviously broken down. And what seems to have happened in Scotland in the last, well, it's hard to put a number on it, but let's just say in the last sort of 20 years, is there's been a slow and steady fusion of social democracy and Scottish nationalism. And Labour's find it very difficult to tailor its narrative to that new reality, and it's something that the SNP has managed to do very effectively. That, Scottish civic nationalism is progressive, it is inclusive, it's egalitarian, and it's based around this concept of Scottish autonomy and Scottish. Well, it can be autonomy within the union as well. And let's remember that Labour was able to tap into that in the 1980s and 1990s. I mean, Labour, if you go back and look at the kind of things that Labour said at that period, that the leaders, the way that their leaders talked about Scotland and the Scottish Parliament, it was this language that you could, scrub out the name of a Labour MP and put on an SNP figure, and you wouldn't be surprised that would be the case. It was quite nationalist in tone. And so Scotland has somehow moved on, and Labour has failed to catch up. It didn't adapt to devolution very well. The Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats in an organisational sense are far more, perhaps a bit more, geared up towards dealing with the way that the devolution work. And the party has certainly struggled to come to terms with the very animal that it is given birth to, which is Scottish devolution. And a way back for the party, this is, I think in one way, Labour coming third might be one of the best things that can happen to it, because then to come behind the Tories in Scotland would just be such a bad result that it may shake away, if you like, figures within the party and say, look, we really need to have a radical rethink. Because every 5 minutes, some Labour figures say, no, we're listening, we're having a radical rethink, we're doing this, we're talking to the public this way. And I mean, I just see it all as kind of window dressing. I mean, the party really has to have a look into itself as an existential entity and figure out, well, what are we for? How do we relate to the new Scotland? I think that's the biggest question that they have. And whether that means becoming, I don't know, an independent Labour Party in Scotland that sits in the chamber, in the House of Commons with the UK Labour Party, I'm not sure. But there are really deep questions for Scottish Labour. And I'm not sure the answers are forthcoming. There are people around the fringes, people like Henry McLeish, that seem to have ideas about how to move Labour's fortunes, but it really is very, very bad for Labour.
I want to move on to the sort of wider EU referendum debate and the impact that might have on another Indyref2, if you like. But before we do, I mean, we know in politics, Kate, that the popularity of different leaders is obviously extremely important to the appeal of political parties. And one of the things that struck me looking at some of the polling around the sort of favourability ratings for some of the party leaders in Scotland was, I mean, the rank sort of unpopularity of David Cameron, perhaps not surprising, but the only person with a positive rating is Nicola Sturgeon. And this made me think a little bit about two things, really. One is something that I think Craig was alluding to earlier, which is that the front bench for the SNP is really good, and actually maybe does come a time when Nicola Sturgeon isn't there anymore that that's maybe where other parties can start to win back support. But also Kezia Dugdale, not very long in the job, but some of her poll ratings aren't particularly good, are they? And in fact, there was one, I think, from YouGov that suggested Scots preferred Ruth Davidson of the Tories to Kezia Dugdale as a leader of the opposition. So, I mean, let's unpick some of that. I mean, Nicola Sturgeon, obviously extremely popular, seems to be doing a good job. She's around for the foreseeable future, I imagine.
Yes, and certainly some times when people get voters into a room and start asking them some questions about how they think about Nicola Sturgeon. One thing that Labour found before the last election was that the word adored kept coming up over and over again. And it's not often that politicians get talked about in such terms. And I think that was quite a shock to the other parties to find out that she was viewed in such a way. She's kind of stepped outside politics.
And out of the shadow of Alex Salmond, which is not an easy thing to do when you consider his legacy.
No, absolutely, and especially when you've been the deputy for such a long time. Not that many deputies have pulled it off, certainly not as swiftly and as well as she has. I think it is very interesting, this poll about Ruth Davidson, and the Tories have really seized on this, but I think this has also created a danger for them. They are all in on Ruth Davidson in this election. She's on the ballot paper. It's Ruth Davidson for a strong opposition. And this is where the problem has been created. It's a kind of classic opposite of usual political parties' expectation management. They've built up the expectation that she will come second. And if she doesn't, there will be a lot more questions asked than is usually asked about the Scottish Conservatives.
It's almost a bubble burst, maybe, if that happens. I mean, let's talk about the EU referendum campaign. I mean, it's not, I think, news to anybody that if you look at the polls, the Scottish voters tend to be much more pro-Remain than the rest of the UK. I mean, we talked about this, I think, before the last general election when you were on the show, that about this point. I mean, presumably, if there is Brexit, if there is a sort of Brexit vote, that triggers another Scottish independence referendum.
Well, certainly Nicola Sturgeon has suggested that it's one of the ways that could trigger another independence referendum. Interestingly, we had a poll last week as well which suggested that Scots are very split on this. About half and half think that it should trigger another independence referendum. And very interestingly, they're split according to age groups. So older people think it shouldn't trigger another independence referendum, and younger people think it should. That's probably unsurprising because that's where they are in terms of having another independence referendum.
Because the younger people are more enthusiastic about independence, full stop, aren't they?
Yeah, but I do think that being so split on this issue is possibly giving the SNP some pause for thought. They've talked a lot about different time scales about when this second referendum could be triggered after Brexit. It's not necessarily that if we all wake up on the morning of the 24th of June to find out that we're leaving the European Union, that things would happen immediately. There's still got to be quite the process there. And I think that's probably because the other thing the SNP are saying is that in order to have another independence referendum, they need to have strong support for the Scottish people to have it, because of course they're afraid of a Quebec-style situation about if they lose the second referendum, that's it off the table.
I'll bring Craig in a moment on the independence question, but on the EU referendum, I mean, one of the things that I've always been curious about is why is it that Scottish people are so sort of pro-Europe? I mean, we were talking to Roger Scully on a previous episode about Wales, and of course Scotland and Wales are obviously very different countries, but still, there are these two devolved assemblies within the United Kingdom. Wales doesn't share that kind of enthusiasm for Europe that Scots seem to, and I'd be interested to get your thoughts on that. And also, I suppose there is maybe a contradiction in terms with the SNP that want independence from the UK but seem to be quite relaxed about Europe. I mean, there's something in Scottish public opinion that is just instinctively pro-European, isn't there?
And I think there's probably a couple of reasons for that. I mean, I think one of them, which is not quite often talked about, but there is an image, certainly in some parts of Scotland, that to be Eurosceptic is a little bit Little Englander. And even that makes it not very Scottish. Do you know what I mean? I mean, there's a couple of different reasons. There's been a history of, certainly in recent years, the Scottish parties being more pro the European Union.
I suppose not just an Englander thing, but a Tory thing as well, presumably.
Yes,
like
absolutely.
Sort of,
Yeah. UKIP have never really managed to make inroads in Scotland in the way they have in England. Now, what side of the circle that's on, whether that's because Scottish people are more pro-EU, or it's because the UKIP haven't made the inroads, it's quite difficult to tell. What I would caution, though, is that the polls seem to be suggesting that actually there's a slight move towards being more Eurosceptic in Scotland as the longer this EU referendum goes on.
Something to keep an eye out for there. I mean, Craig, I'll bring you in on the independence question in Europe. I mean, what's your take on some of those issues? Lots to unpick.
Yeah, well, the Euroscepticism in Scotland one is interesting because if you break down some of the data on how people feel about the European Union and how people feel about democracy in Europe and trust in European institutions, it's no different really to the kind of UK average. It just seems that the Scottish element is articulated in a different way. To compare again to Wales, and I haven't listened to your podcast with Roger yet.
Shocking.
I mentioned it. I'm talking about his own research actually.
Yeah.
You find that UK-wide political factors have a far greater bearing on how people vote in Wales than they do in Scotland, because Scottish politics is insulated to a greater extent from UK-wide politics than Welsh politics. The Welsh media is less, it is weaker. There's the same level of national newspapers. I mean, there is national newspapers. Their readership is very low in Wales, and so British issues infiltrate into Welsh politics to a much greater extent. Hence why Plaid Cymru were absolutely delighted, probably more so than the SNP, for Leanne Wood to be involved in the leadership debate. I think one thing to take into consideration is that, who is the main political figure in Scotland, and I'm asking kind of the general public here, it's a rhetorical question, that is the main Eurosceptic figures. Whereas in England, you could say, well, you've got Boris Johnson, you've got Gove, etc. There's nobody here in Scotland really articulating that Leave campaign. You have David Coburn, I'm not say anymore, but there is nobody in Scotland at an elite political level that is really articulating a Eurosceptic point of view. Every single leader of the main parties are in favour of European membership. There are obviously Eurosceptic communities. I mean, the fishing community in Scotland would perhaps be an area that would be of greater interest because of the common fisheries policy. And I know anecdotally that there are some in that community, quite a lot in that community, that would probably vote to leave. But I think it's the fact that there's not a kind of a high-level political elite narrative around Euroscepticism in Scotland anywhere near the extent down south. It just doesn't get that same hearing in Scotland.
Well, we've only got a couple of minutes left, but I want to bring Kate in on some events south of the border, I think, which is sort of ruining your day off, I think, today. Certainly Ken Livingstone's interviews yesterday obviously caused a furore on the front pages this morning. I mean, very briefly, a couple of minutes on that. I mean, what's your take on that situation? How damaging might that be for Labour north of the border, but also more generally?
Certainly, you know, a week before elections, it feeds into a couple of narratives, none of which are very helpful for Scotland. One of which is a party in disarray. And we've seen it doesn't look as if Scottish voters have trust in the competence of anybody else except the SNP at the minute. Another is a party at each other's throats, which again...
divided parties don't win elections.
Absolutely.
Is the old adage.
People tend not to vote for people who are fighting each other. And then there's the issue itself. Ken McIntosh is fighting very heavily for a constituency seat, one of the few that some people in Labour think they might potentially hold on to, which has one of the biggest Jewish communities in the whole of Scotland. And he visited a Jewish charity yesterday to try and reassure them that Labour was not anti-Semitic. This is a very
Which is not what you want to be doing a week after an election,
message to be trying to suggest, while at the same time saying, please vote for us next Thursday.
All very difficult. Well, that's all we've got time for this bumper sort of bonus edition of the Polling Matters Political Betting Show this week. A big thanks to my guests Kate Devlin and Craig McAngus. And stay tuned for more for another episode next week where we'll be talking about the results and what that means for politics in the future.